Good morning. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for our Northern Light Health Business to Business Zoom conference. Today, our theme is vaccine hesitancy, myths, misinformation, and what we know now. The pandemic has been very dynamic. We will provide you with the latest information, recognizing that it is a continuously evolving situation. We are now into our 5th month of vaccinating people. While people of all ages may be hesitant to receive a vaccination, we are seeing a drop-off in demand as vaccines have been made available to everyone 16 and older. We'll take a look at the current status of COVID-19 and vaccinations, and with this as a platform, we'll explore vaccine hesitancy with our panel of special guests and experts. I'm Dr. Ed Gilkey, Senior Physician Executive at Northern Light Beacon Health. I'll be your moderator for the next hour. Our panelists today are Dr. Melissa McGinnis, a virologist from the University of Maine, Dr. Elizabeth Marnick, an immunologist from Hudson University, Dr. Jim Jarvis, a physician leader and clinical leader for mass vaccinations at Northern Light Health. And our other special guests today are Remy Gohegan, Tanisha Gilbert, and Emily Mclaughlin. They are community members who will share what they are hearing and seeing in their communities. Before we get started, I will read our legal disclosure. The coronavirus pandemic is an ongoing, continuously evolving situation. Northern Light Health encourages everyone to follow federal and state governmental guidance and mandates. Northern Light Health does not know the particulars of your situation, so the information presented today is general in nature and is based upon Northern Light Health's own experience, which may or may not apply in your specific situation and which may be revised as we learn more about the coronavirus. Accordingly, following any guidance Northern Light Health presents today in no way guarantees that you, your employees, and/or your customers and clients will not contract or spread the coronavirus. A reminder, this hour is for you. If at any time you have a question for one of our panelists, please use the chat function. I'll keep track of your questions and have our speakers respond. Also, I hope each of you will take a few minutes immediately following this hour to answer our quick 5-question survey. Your input directly affects our topics and helps guide our future conferences. I'll start us off with some updates. Looking at the entire world, we recognize that new cases per day and deaths per day have been increasing over the last 2 weeks. You'll note that in the lower right corner where it says 14-day change. Vaccinations worldwide have been quite variable between countries and continents on the next slide. Keep in mind that the rate for a 2-dose vaccine to fully vaccinate everyone would be 200 doses per 100 people. This graph helps us to understand what has been achieved worldwide during the first 5 months of vaccinating people. Now let's take a look at Maine. We pay very close attention to the new hospitalizations. This is not a rate, but an absolute number. Looking to the right of the graph, we see a rising slope, and that's that orange line. And we also know the average age of the patients being hospitalized is getting younger. On the next slide, the 2 graphs represent the data in the table to the left. What you see is that most of the positive cases are in the younger age groups, so that's the blue bars, and most of the deaths are in the older age groups. We have known this from the beginning. What's different is we are seeing people in the younger age groups dying. 2 people in their 20s died in the last several weeks in Maine. While one had an underlying condition, this was felt not to contribute to the person's death. Looking at Maine and vaccinations, Maine is doing relatively well with getting people vaccinated and is in the lead nationwide for percentage of people with a final dose. Please note that these numbers reflect the entire population of Maine, so that 39.19% will be a little bit different than if you just look at eligibles only. And you can see that this graphic of most of the vaccinations have been done in the older age groups. Now I want to touch upon PASC, also known as post-acute sequelae of SARS-CoV-2, or long COVID, also known as long hauler syndrome, post-COVID syndrome, and long-term COVID. The clinical manifestations are listed, and you'll note in that grouping of manifestations, they hit all organ systems. Many of you probably have heard of COVID fog. This is an impairment of thinking during the weeks and months of recovery that is thought to be an effect on the brain caused by the virus and falls into this PASC category. PASC occurs in upwards of 30% of people, notably people with mild disease and people in the younger age groups. There's many examples across the country of athletically fit people in their 20s who go from being capable of running marathons to barely being able to balance and walk. PASC is becoming more known. However, it is a severely under-recognized consequence without a clear end. Does it last 3 months, 6 months? And it's affecting all ages and health status. The final point on this slide is a quote from Johns Hopkins University Medicine Group. Prevention is the best way to avoid COVID complications via following the precautions of masking, distancing, hand washing, and vaccinations. This collection cannot be overstated. So, this pandemic is almost over, right? Let's take a quick look at what we know now. First, worldwide cases and deaths per day are increasing. New variants with unfavorable characteristics are emerging across the globe, and we've spoke about these variants in prior sessions. Vaccination rates are variable across countries and continents, and quite a few of these continents is quite low. Main hospitalizations are increasing modestly. Herd immunity may occur at 70 to 85% vaccination rate. Maine is best in class of vaccination rate at approximately 40%. So you could see the gap not only for Maine, but around the country and the world. Prevention is an important tool. And then highlighted here in bold, achieving herd immunity is the global strategy, one person at a time. So let's transition to our roundtable discussion with that platform in mind. And we'll discuss vaccine hesitancy. We'll start off, Dr. McGinnis, please introduce yourself and share why today's topic interests you.
Good morning. My name is Mrna Vaccines, and I am an associate professor at the University of Maine. I am a virologist, and I've been studying how viruses infect cells and cause disease for the past 20 years. And over the past year, I have served as the lead of the UMaine System COVID-19 Science Advisory Board. And I'm delighted to be here today to help provide answers to questions about SARS-CoV-2 and the vaccine. I believe that vaccination is our best defense against COVID-19 transmission and the best way to get back to the state of normalcy.
Thanks, Dr. McGinnis. Dr. Marnick, please introduce yourself and also comment on your interest in this topic.
Everybody, I am Dr. Elizabeth Marnick. I'm an assistant professor at Husson University. My PhD is in immunology and genetics, and I spent my whole 5-6 years doing my PhD focused on understanding how the immune system develops an antibody response, which is important both in the course of a normal infection, but also in the course of vaccination. But my side hobby throughout my career in science has been trying to help people who don't have a science background understand science. Science is filled with a lot of technical jargon, and it's really important for me to help make science understandable and accessible. So when the pandemic hit, I was able to put my background information with immunology, together with that passion to make science accessible and understandable. And I've been helping to bring a lot of awareness to how your immune system works and how vaccinations work. And I agree with Dr. McGinnis that our best way out of this pandemic is to get people vaccinated, both to help prevent death, but also just to help our lives get back to normal and to help prevent long COVID. And I'm excited to be here to help answer people's questions.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Mornick. Dr. Jarvis, please introduce yourself and describe what you've seen over time as a clinical leader organizing vaccinations for all of us.
Thanks, Ed. So I'm Jim Jarvis. I am a family physician by training, and actually that's where my interest is right now for this particular discussion, because preventative medicine is a key factor in family medicine in preventing all diseases, not just COVID. But for the last 14 months or so, I have been the physician lead for Northern Light Health's response to COVID-19, and since mid-December, maybe a little bit earlier than that, have been leading its vaccination efforts as well. So the things that I have seen that have been interesting is, of course, we first started vaccinating first responders and healthcare workers, many of whom were incredibly eager to step up and get vaccinated simply because their day-to-day job put them at risk of getting COVID. We certainly saw some hesitancy there, though the rates in Maine for hesitancy amongst healthcare workers was lower than we've seen around the country, which was always good news for us. Similarly, we started vaccinating people in long-term care facilities, and we've seen the success of that. In fact, in the state of Maine, where we had, again, a higher uptake of individuals being vaccinated, both by staff and the residents at these long-term care facilities, we saw a dramatic decrease in the number of outbreaks that we've had in those locations. Unfortunately, we've had a few sporadic outbreaks recently, and they've all been tied to unvaccinated individuals who then infected others within there. So again, it's the reason why we talk about that vaccination is the way out of the pandemic. But I think the thing that's been exciting me the most is the last few weeks at our large-scale vaccination clinics, as we've been seeing younger and younger individuals coming in and getting vaccinated. I can certainly talk about the Cross Insurance Center, where often I'll see several thousand people a day coming through, and it's been great to see the diversity, both in terms of race, ethnicity, and age coming through, and everyone being incredibly excited about their ability to once again feel safe and comfortable in our communities. This is a community effort, and when we talk about immunity, we talk about an entire community becoming immune to a disease, and the only way that can happen is through vaccination. So thank you, Ed.
Excellent. Thanks, Dr. Jarvis. Remy, please introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Remy Gohegan, and I'm a third-year undergraduate student at the University of Maine, Orono, pursuing a degree in microbiology.
Great. Welcome, Remy. Tanisha, please introduce yourself.
Good morning. My name is Tanisha Gilbert, and I am the program coordinator for Acadia's wellness program called Healthy Life Resources. I have worked at Northern Light Health for a little over 5 years, starting as a surgical technologist.
Great. Well, welcome. Emily, please introduce yourself.
Hello, my name is Emily Mclaughlin. I'm a fourth-year undergraduate student at the University of Maine. I'm pursuing degrees in microbiology and Spanish.
Excellent. Well, thanks to everyone. I will start off by asking our special guests in turn to share with us a common reason they have been hearing or reading about from their peer group about why people are hesitant to get the vaccination. We'll then turn to our panel of experts to discuss. So let's start off with Remy. What are the biggest vaccine concerns you're hearing among peers?
So by far the biggest vaccine concern that I've been hearing is about long-term safety. So how do we assess and how do we think about long-term impacts of taking these vaccines?
Great. Dr. McGinnis, would you mind tackling that one?
Absolutely. So I can certainly understand this concern, and I realize that these vaccines were developed very rapidly, and that this has been further complicated by a lot of misinformation that has been circulating. And I just want to talk about how these vaccines were developed so quickly. And these vaccines were developed faster than any other vaccine in history. And it is truly remarkable, and these vaccines are safe and highly effective. But there are a few reasons why and how they were able to be developed so quickly. So number one is that we're in a pandemic that has completely impacted human health and resulted in massive disease and suffering. and impacted the economy, education, mental health, and every aspect of our lives. But also there has been years of research that helped to support the early research and development for these vaccines due to other virus outbreaks that really provided the foundation for this development. Additionally, the government collaborated with and supported the research of these companies like Moderna and Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson through Operation Warp Speed. And that provided billions of dollars in funding. And also scientists and physicians around the world were collaborating to share information. So there was this effort to overall end the pandemic. And so I think that there was less competition between companies and between scientists. Also, the development of vaccines normally takes many years for research and development. And then it has to go through the clinical trials. And then if a drug or a vaccine is successful, will a company start to produce and manufacture the vaccine or the drug? But the financial support that was provided by the government allowed these companies to work at risk. And what that means is that they were able to start producing the vaccine before the trials were completed. So that way, if the trials were successful, they could get it distributed very quickly into the world. And that's exactly what we're seeing. So these trials were extensive. They were not cut short. They included tens of thousands of volunteers. And once these vaccines were deemed safe and extremely successful in preventing illness, especially severe illness and hospitalizations, then these vaccines received emergency use authorization. And that allowed them to be distributed prior to receiving full FDA approval. But we're expecting to see that soon. So now what we're experiencing is really the largest vaccination campaign in the history of the world. And over 250 million people have received the vaccine. So this is larger than any clinical trial that I'm aware of. If anyone else is aware of a clinical trial that's larger than this, please let me know. And of course, we have seen some side effects like allergic reactions or some adverse reactions like with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. But when you look at the large number of people that have been vaccinated with very few side effects, it's really amazing to see how safe and effective it is, especially in these real-world studies that are continuing. And the safety of these vaccines is continuing to be monitored. And this is monitored through a committee known as Vaccines and Related Biological Products Advisory Committee. And we know that the systems that we have in place are working because when the adverse events with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine were noted, there was a pause on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine so that it could be fully investigated. So I think that this shows that everyone is fully aware and they're looking out for the safety of everyone who's receiving these vaccines. And they're not expected to have any impact on long-term health. And that's because the material used in the vaccines is processed very quickly by our bodies so that we can make an immune response and develop a memory immune response that will then protect us from infection. And so when people say, you know, what if there's a long-term effect of these vaccines? I also want to say there are long-term effects with COVID, and we know much more about that. We know that there have been over 155 million people that have gotten COVID and over 3 million deaths. And there have been very serious complications like long COVID, like you mentioned in the beginning, Dr. Gilkey, and these can have a long-term impact on the brain and heart and the lungs. So I think if you take all of this information together, the benefits of the vaccine far outweigh the risks. And the risks of actually getting COVID have serious impacts on our long-term health.
So Dr. McGinnis, we have a question from our audience about what's the effect of exempting the pharmaceutical manufacturers from liability of any vaccine side effects? Does that impact on the safety equation at all?
I don't think that that impacts the safety equation because, like I said, there are third-party committees that are monitoring the safety of these vaccines. And the people that are monitoring the vaccines, they don't have any financial investment in the development of these vaccines. And even when clinical trials are being conducted, there's a third party that's monitoring those clinical trials. It's not actually Moderna or Pfizer or Johnson & Johnson that's watching the data come in. It is a completely independent party that's monitoring it. And only once they have reviewed the data is it then released to the organizations that started the clinical trial.
Excellent. Well, thank you very much.
Ed, can I comment just a little bit on that too as well?
Please do.
Yeah, one thing to remember is these companies don't have blanket immunity. This is immunity from the actual vaccine. But if they were to cause, say they in production have a manufacturing error that caused harm, they would be liable for that. And also, it's not that it takes away people's ability for recourse, it just takes it away from the company. It puts that recourse back on the federal government. So there is actually what people have called the Immunization Court. There's a special one specifically for COVID vaccines, simply because of the speed that we needed to develop this and to make sure that companies were on board and to provide them that relief. But there is an avenue for individuals. What we've often heard is, oh, well, that court never ever sides with individuals who have complained. First of all, that's not true. When individuals have been harmed by vaccine, they have certainly been compensated by that. But the fact of the matter is all vaccines, including the COVID vaccines, are so incredibly safe. It is rare that somebody is actually injured by one, and therefore compensation isn't provided because they haven't actually been injured. And so I think that's the confusion people have, particularly when they hear this, oh, well, they're immune from it. So it must, why would they care about safety? Well, they care about safety a great deal because it's their name that is being spread out over the media. And I can assure you, Johnson & Johnson was not happy about the pause, and Moderna and Pfizer are delighted that they did not have a pause because it is their name brand that's out there. And that is a bigger liability to them than actually vaccine safety is.
Thanks, Jim. I think that's very important to understand. Dr. Marnick?
Yeah, I don't mean to belabor this point, but I think the long-term safety issue is the biggest thing that I hear people worried about.
Me too.
So the only thing that I wanted to add to this conversation is that we know how vaccines work because of extensive decades of research. And if you go into the history of all these vaccines and you look for adverse reactions that happen to them, because they do happen, but they're very rare. No adverse reaction has happened after 8 weeks, which is why when the CDC wanted the data for this emergency use authorization, they required that 8 weeks of safety data before they would then authorize these vaccines for emergency use. So we never see long-term health impacts from a vaccine that don't appear within those 8 weeks after initial vaccination. And also there's a lot of misconception that mRNA is completely new and foreign as is being given to humans, and that's not the case. The first mRNA vaccine for cancer immune therapy was actually given to humans in 2009. So we actually have a lot of research that shows mRNA itself is not dangerous. So yes, this is the first mRNA vaccines for infectious disease, but we've had mRNA given to other individuals for other things without any concerning safety signals.
Great. Well, thank you, Dr. Marnick. I think we've all come to appreciate that the long-term effects when we realize that these are, I'll put in quotes, new vaccines, forget about the moment of building on all the history that we have with vaccines, to our general public. It certainly seems like these are brand new, and we don't have enough time to actually see what the long-term effects. So Dr. Marnick, your 8-week window is very helpful for us to put some perspective. And I think we have a much better sense of the safety issues here and how they're being mitigated. I'm going to switch now to Tanisha. Would you share with us what the biggest vaccine concerns you're hearing from your peers?
Sure. So one of the major concerns that I've heard is just the general mistrust of the numbers and how deaths are being attributed. There's this belief that there's an effort to inflate the numbers and control people through fear and panic.
But that's kind of loaded. There's lots of pathways to go down with that, for sure. So I think the issue of trust and then the information being shared with us, specifically the data, there's lots of ways to count, if you will. So Dr. Marnick, would you tackle that one for us?
Yeah, so this is definitely a concern I hear a lot of people have as well. So one of the ways that you can look at this is that over the last decades, years, governing bodies, governments, organizations have collected information that gives us an idea of how many people die per year on average from all sorts of causes. So that gives us a level of baseline about the average levels of death that happen both on a country level for individual countries, but also at a global level. How many people do we expect will die a year from disease, from accidents, from all of those sorts of things? So if COVID-19 deaths were being misattributed and they were actually caused by pre-existing conditions or other things, then we would not expect to see deaths above that baseline because there'd be nothing else contributing to more deaths. So if you go through and look at the number of people who've died in 2020 compared to the average number of people we'd expect to die in 2020, we see a huge excess above that expected average. And this is not just in the United States, this is globally and also on individual country levels, where if this was being just misattributed, we would not see increased deaths overall. They would have just been coded differently. So this really shows us that we're not skewing the numbers, that there are significant amounts of people who are dying above what we would expect to see normally.
Thank you. Thank you for that insight. So, Emily, share with us what you're hearing.
I know one big concern I'm hearing is about blood clots. I'm sure that we are all very inundated with news with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. And I think a very practical question people may have is, if the Johnson & Johnson vaccine becomes available to them and they haven't been vaccinated, should they get it?
Great question. Jim, we'll go in your direction with that one.
Yeah, so of course the concern that Johnson & Johnson was about blood clots, and we've seen this before because AstraZeneca had a similar issue, and so there were concerns about the AstraZeneca vaccine, which was being predominantly used across Europe and in some other nations around the world, in some other countries around the world, but the blood clot issue really is that a very small number of individuals. In fact, in the United States, it was about 12 over about 6 million people that had already received the vaccine. So a very, very small number. They were all women, most of whom were under the age of 40. There were some severe consequences from the particular type of clot that they had, including one death and one long-term case of somebody being in the intensive care unit. And all those individuals had been vaccinated with the Johnson & Johnson vaccine. Right now, to date, there is really still not a causality between the two, meaning it is still not proven that the shot was what caused the clot to occur. It's just that the clots occurred within a reasonable time frame of when the shot was given. And why I say that, it's important for us to realize, because every day people do develop this particular type of clot as a normal part of our background disease process in the world. And it really doesn't seem that these people were outside the statistical norm for having these clots be developed. But it also shows that our process works, that we do report when we think that there might be an adverse reaction to a particular product, whether that be a vaccine or a medication, and that we actually sit down and review the data. After reviewing of the data, both the European Union and the United States came to the conclusion that the risk of the Johnson & Johnson causing this clot was so low that it was much better for people to be vaccinated, because the risk of COVID-19 and the clots that COVID-19 cause, as well as all of the other concerns that COVID-19 causes, far outweigh the risk of the shot if it was indeed the cause of those clots. And so I think that's what happened. Now, of course, because of media, there was a lot of discussion about this. Certainly the pause on Johnson & Johnson made it a big deal here in the United States, as we had expected that particular vaccine to be the answer for being able to vaccinate those who are homebound, out in small rural communities. So certainly affected Maine. But I think, to tell you the truth, it was a little bit overblown. Really what they should have focused in on was the process was working, and that safety is our #1 priority, that we were willing to take a chance and pause on Johnson & Johnson to look at the data more clearly. And when we did, we really found that there was no concern there, and that people should go ahead and receive that vaccine if offered to them, and that's the one that they're choosing to get.
So Dr. Jarvis, thank you for that. I'll add, there's another layer of safety discussion in here as well. I think during that pause of just short of 11 days, I think the physicians and other providers were informed that if they diagnose this particular condition, CVST, that they don't treat with heparin, which is a typical drug used for blood clots. And in fact, they can use a very commonly available treatment called intravenous immunoglobulin. And if a person does end up with CVST, whether it's related to vaccine or not, we have effective treatments at this point as well. So that really adds another layer of safety.
Yeah, Ed, and I think that's a great point. And again, it shows that our system works. We recognize that there may be an issue here, and it may be an issue around education, and we provided that education. And we do that on a regular basis. I would say that probably once a week, I receive some kind of alert that says, hey, you should be aware of this medical condition that is now more prevalent in Maine than we typically see, or this treatment plan is now available to you. Again, I think we should have celebrated this as showing that we have now been sharing information far more readily than we had before. But even before, we shared information amongst clinicians pretty readily, and so that's important. And I think, Ed, you're spot on to point out that if somebody was to develop this incredibly rare form of blood clot, that there is a treatment for it, and doctors now are very well prepared to be able to deal with that situation. But again, incredibly rare.
Great. Well, thanks for that. I'm going to get caught up on our chat room a little bit here. One of the questions is, what is the thinking about people with long haulers getting the vaccine? Does it help? And Dr. Jarvis responded, there have been reports that some feel better after being vaccinated, so yes, it may help. Dr. Marnick reported that Dr. Iwasaki at Yale has launched a study on vaccination as a potential treatment to help those with long COVID. So I don't know if you want to elaborate on that at all, Dr. Marnick. I know it's pretty early in the course here.
Yeah, Dr. Akiko Iwasaki is one of the foremost immunologists in the country. She's pretty amazing. I have a fangirl crush on her. But she has some really interesting both articles people can look up if they Google her about the reasons why she thinks vaccination may be helping some patients who have long COVID. And we do have some evidence that in some people, they can't effectively completely clear the infection, and it seems to have pockets of areas where the infection may be hiding out, and that could be contributing to some people's long COVID. We don't know if that's the case in all patients. It could be a lot of different things, but she developed a really fascinating study to look at who is actually getting a benefit from getting, if they have long COVID symptoms, who actually benefits from then getting a vaccination to see if it is potentially helping.
So my understanding currently, the recommendation is if you've had COVID-19 documented by a positive test, you are still eligible for a vaccination. Is that correct?
That's correct. In fact, we actually strongly recommend that. We recommend it that you can get that you can be vaccinated anytime after you're out of the quarantine period for being acutely effective. And we hope that you then get vaccinated before 90 days. And the reason why we use that 90-day term is because, and again, this gets back to the reason why vaccination is more important than natural immunity, is that we have seen that natural immunity to COVID wanes after about 3 months. And so you would actually then not be protected against future cases of COVID-19. And therefore, that's why we recommend that you get vaccinated after your quarantine period and before that 90 days has elapsed, so that you now have antibodies due to the vaccination. Again, another reason why vaccine is our way out of the pandemic, because natural immunity will not be. We've known this for years because we've always known that coronaviruses do not provide long-term natural immunity to human beings. And we can see that in our own lives because we always get colds every now and again. Except during this year, as we've been wearing masks, respiratory diseases, including colds, have gone way down. And so just showed that masking was the right thing for us to do.
And probably always was, right? So another question here about how long does the protection last from the vaccines? And Dr. Marnick, you addressed that somewhat. At least 6 months, but that's all the data that we have now. So we're looking forward to it. And then the follow-up would be, will we need boosters and that? So if you could comment a bit more than the chat room answer.
Yeah, so we're limited by the time that we have this data, right? Because we have the trials, the emergency use authorization were put through about 2 to 3 months after the trial started. So we're still following those participants to see exactly how long protection lasts. Moderna and Pfizer released data that showed still really great antibody response at 6 months. The media then said it's only going to last 6 months. No, that is not what they said. They showed that the protection lasts still at 6 months. It's likely going to last longer because antibodies don't suddenly drop off a cliff. But the exact number of how long it will last, we don't know because we're still following those patients and we don't like to say things we don't know for sure yet. The other question is variants. So far, we have data that shows these vaccines do protect against the currently known circulating variants. They do have a little bit less effectiveness, but they still protect. But the more we let the virus spread, the more it's going to mutate, and eventually that may change. So we could end up needing boosters, not because our immunity to the old one is waning, but because we are letting the virus run rampant and we're getting mutations that evade immunity.
Great, thank you. Well, this is a tough question, Dr. McGinnis. I'm going to share this one with you. How effectively are vaccines being distributed? Why are there discrepancies between different areas of the country and where the vaccines are greater or less available? And it actually, there's another question in the chat box about the politicization. So, you know, maybe you could try to tackle that. I mean, we all have opinions on it, I'm sure. So, Dr. McGinnis.
Yeah, sure. I think that's a tough question. But, you know, initially we saw massive vaccination clinics across the country. And I think that was the best way to get people vaccinated and get as many people vaccinated as possible in the beginning. And now what we're seeing is a decline in people attending those vaccination clinics. And I think that now we need to start reaching out to other remote parts of the country. And so there has been a shift from the massive vaccination clinics into mobile vaccination clinics so that we can start to reach people who don't have a means to get to those sites and reach people in remote parts of the country. And I think that's true also for remote parts of the world. And so I think that that's sort of the next phase in vaccination, which is also very important. Regarding the politicization of both the virus and the disease and the vaccine, of course, I think this has been really a struggle. And I think that we need to come together as a country, and it doesn't need to be something that is Democrat versus Republican. We're all in this together. We're all human beings. And I think that we're all really bound by wanting to protect one another. And so the best way to protect one another is to become vaccinated. And another really important point is once we do become vaccinated, we have to continue to follow these practices of distancing and wearing face coverings in the beginning because we don't know who has been vaccinated. And like Dr. Mrna said, we have to prevent the spread of these variants because every time we spread the virus, we're giving the virus an incubator and the virus is going to continue to mutate and we're going to have continued spread of these variants. The only way that we can stop that is by halting the spread through vaccination and through these other practices in our own behaviors of distancing and wearing face coverings until we have this pandemic under control, and then we can move more into a state of normalcy.
Excellent. Any other comments on the distribution and politicization of the vaccination?
No, I think it follows actually the history that we've seen before with healthcare. We know there are disparities in certain populations, and we know there are disparities between states and certain locations within those states. And you can almost see all of that occur with our vaccination efforts. I used to always talk about, I could never understand how West Virginia was #1 in vaccinating in the country because they rarely are number one in anything positive on the healthcare front. And that's not a slight about our friends in West Virginia at all. It's just a fact. But then what did we see? West Virginia is not doing very well in vaccination anymore. They were excellent at having private and public partnerships go out and vaccinate those people who are most eager to be vaccinated, but they peaked at about 1/3 of their population. In Maine, we're starting to see that now after 50% of our eligible population got vaccinated. I was asked the other day, should I be proud of the fact that we're #1 in the country? And I said, I'm proud of it, but I'm not happy with it. I want to be better than #1. I'd like to see us reach out to more individuals who are either disenfranchised or not represented well enough to get the vaccine up in the front of the line, but then reach out to those who are hesitant as well, which is why these kind of discussions are so important, so we can reach everybody in every aspect, because until we get every Mainer that's eligible to vaccinated, we're going to still be in the same problems that we're having now.
Yeah, and during the slide presentations, I did make a point that the global strategy is to try to achieve herd immunity. You know, all things considered, the collective That's been the approach that we're taking. So, hence the importance here. So I'm going to switch gears on us just for a few minutes and come back to questions in the chat room. But I wanted to switch over. Tanisha, could you talk to us a little bit about your personal experiences with the vaccines and what you've been hearing out there? Not yet. You're connecting to audio. Now maybe.
Can you hear me now?
I can.
All right, sorry, having some technical difficulties. Yeah, I definitely have some personal experience that I'd love to share. I was raised religious, and due to those beliefs, there was this huge mistrust about vaccines and just medicine in general. My parents were very cautious about what was injected into my body, and I attended private Christian school, and my vaccination record was never an issue. So when I attended secular college, I had to get certain vaccinations just to be able to attend classes. So this mindset and the way of thinking really clouded my judgment when it came to getting my COVID-19 vaccine. And I was hesitant to get my vaccine, but ultimately I chose to get it after doing my own research because I decided that there are people out there like my grandfather in a nursing home who I care about and I love, and I would feel terrible if anything ever happened to him. So my decision to get a vaccine was about others and choosing to do the right thing and protecting the people that I care about.
Yeah, that's another piece of it that we kind of forget about as we're getting online for our vaccine, huh? Yeah, well, thanks for that. Remy, how about from your point of view?
So I have had conversations with friends and family members, and throughout all of this, it's really made me appreciate how difficult it is to communicate with individuals who might be vaccine hesitant, and the approaches that are taken and really building trust, because there is so much misinformation. And I think a lot of people are really confused about what are reputable sources and who they trust and where they go to for information. So really a lot of these conversations started with, trying to understand what knowledge was there about how the science of vaccines and how they work. And then really kind of building off of that about safety, efficacy, and pointing to as many reputable resources, and then really explaining why we can trust these, the processes of data collection, and why I would trust these sources. So that's been my experience with talking to vaccine hesitant individuals.
Remy, when we were talking last week in preparation for this, you really opened up my eyes, I have to say. I can think back where everything on the internet was considered trustworthy. Now that seems like a very long time ago, I must say. And I certainly thought in the course of my training and education, the people who were talking to me, they're trustworthy, they're teaching me this stuff. But when you said to me last week that your generation, as students, you need to actually be equipped with the tools to effectively understand what information you could trust and not trust, that's really made me consider a great deal. So thank you for that. I appreciate that.
Thank you.
Emily, what's been your experience?
I've had a very good experience. I got my second dose of the Pfizer vaccine yesterday. And I think one thing I see around my friends, even people who are very pro-vaccine, is it's not fun to get a shot. And I think a lot of people, more than we would think, have a big fear of needles. And I think a tricky thing with the COVID vaccine is it's really up to individuals when and where they get the vaccine. So I know I have many friends with the best of intentions who just take a very long time or don't ever get it, because I have a list of 100 things I'd rather do than get a needle in my arm. So I think it can be kind of tricky as adults to say, well, we have to do this, even though I know there's a lot of anxiety surrounding going in and getting a shot.
Thank you
Emily,
for
that's a
that.
great point. And I think as we transition now away from our large scale vaccination clinics and put them into more intimate settings and trying to make things more readily available, such as now no longer requiring appointments and being able to walk in, hopefully very shortly we'll see widespread use in our practices as well as retail pharmacies, and making it more convenient. And convenience often is the way to go nowadays, right? It's much easier to use your Starbucks app than it is to actually walk in and talk to a barista. And so we know that those are the kind of things that we need to do to reach out. I applaud all of you for sharing your stories. I did want to comment a little bit about the how religion has played a role into this for us. And in some ways, I think it's somewhat unfortunate, because if we look at certain religious tenets, they're actually based on sound scientific principles. The reason why in the Judeo-Christian belief was that circumcision was on the 8th day or later was because it took that long for babies to develop enough vitamin K to have their clotting system work so that they didn't have bleeding aspects after circumcision. The kosher model that's in the Judeo and Muslim cultures were again to protect you, because the certain things that they avoided during to keep kosher actually were things that caused disease before we had things like refrigeration and purification and things like that. And so actually religious beliefs very early on and principles that they set were actually based on sound scientific principles of observation. And that's really what we're talking about now, is observation. Observationally, we have realized that COVID, the disease, is far worse than preventing that disease, regardless of what the consequences are that prevention. And similarly, when we talk about vaccine, same thing. We have known for more than 100 years how effective, in fact, 200 years of how effective immunizations are. You know, when Jenner first inoculated people with cowpox to prevent smallpox, it was revolutionary. And then he was just an amazing person who literally went out and gave away his procedure and process around the world for free. But there was vaccine hesitancy then, and he faced a lot of criticism about this kind of thing. But he literally saved millions of lives. And that's what we're asking people to do now. With the thing that he thought about a long time ago, and building on those principles, we're able to now stop a pandemic that has unfortunately killed hundreds of millions of people.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. While you're at the podium, if you will, we have a question from one of our participants on Facebook. Can COVID-19 vaccines mess with people's medications?
Yeah, that's a great question. And typically we don't see anything like that when we talk about vaccinations. Now, we are being very cautious with this, and sometimes we may ask a little bit more of a health history before we administer a vaccine. But really, for most people, if they're with chronic illnesses, regardless of what their chronic medications are, vaccines are very safe, and in particular, the 3 vaccines that are available here in the United States. We may talk about a pause between one thing or another, but really that hasn't been a concern. And, you know, I've been fortunate to work at the Cross Insurance Center. We've now gone over 100,000 vaccinations administered and seen very, very few adverse events from that. And that's a wonderful thing to say. In fact, if we talked about, you know, the Cross Insurance Center for its normal use for basketball games and other sporting events and concerts, we would have seen more adverse events just from having a general population here than we've actually seen while we're vaccinating that same number of people. Partly that's because I think healthier people have come in and seen that, but we know we have people from all walks of life that have come through to be vaccinated. So it actually confirms to me that these vaccines are safe and have not had problems with anybody with any particular medical condition. I did see somebody in the chat asked a question about those who already have autoimmune diseases, and could this cause an exacerbation of that? And actually that biologically, that makes little sense. Autoimmune diseases are usually caused by an antibody to a particular a substance or part of our body. And so vaccination wouldn't affect that. It would say that because vaccination is similar to the process that we talk about when people get infected, and infections themselves don't cause particular exacerbations of any particular autoimmune disease outside of what that autoimmune disease already is related to. And so we have not, again, seen anybody who has had adverse reactions who have a known autoimmune disease, even some pretty severe autoimmune diseases. In fact, it's safer for them to get the vaccine because they're already vulnerable due to that.
Great. That's great insight, Dr. Jarvis. You know, I'm going to switch over now. Remy, I'll ask you in follow-up, what other concerns are you hearing from your peer group?
So another really big one that I'm hearing is the concern that these vaccines will alter people's DNA.
Dr. McGinnis, you care to weigh in on that?
Sure. And I also just want to follow up on something that Remy and Dr. Gilkey brought up earlier. It's that there's so much misinformation that's circulating on the internet, and we have to not believe everything we read. We really have to drill down on the information and critically think through it and look for reliable, trustworthy sources. And, if someone has posted something on Facebook and, your cousin says that these vaccines are changing your DNA, you might want to say, well, where did you read that? Can you provide the source for me so that I can read into that more, rather than just believing what someone is saying on Facebook or somewhere else on the internet, and then find multiple sources and then critically think through the information. So if we were to just break this down and say, could these vaccines actually alter your DNA? Let's just think about this. So the goal of the vaccines is to deliver the instructions or the blueprint for your cells to produce the spike proteins. And these are the proteins that protrude from the surface of the virus. We've all seen pictures of the SARS-CoV-2 virus circulating in the news. And so the goal is to express those spike proteins so that our body can produce antibodies to the spike proteins to prevent infection. So the vaccines that we have available from Pfizer and Moderna are mRNA vaccines, and the Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a viral vector-based vaccine that does deliver DNA to encode for spike in your cells. And we have to think back to the central dogma of molecular biology that we learned in high school. DNA is made into mRNA, is made into proteins. And DNA is the genetic material that's present in the nucleus of our cells. And this serves as the instructions to build all of the cells and tissues and organs that make up our bodies. And if we think of this as kind of a building project to build a house, the DNA are those instructions, and they're sort of the plans in the architect's mind before the project. And we can't access those plans. In order to access those plans, we need a blueprint. And so to make a blueprint, the DNA is transcribed into mRNA. And the mRNA gets shuttled out of the nucleus into the cytoplasm. And there it gets sent to the builders. And the mRNA gets made into proteins. And this is just like the blueprints getting made into building a house by the building team. So if we think about Pfizer and Moderna, which are mRNA vaccines, they already are the messenger RNA or the blueprints. They don't need to go to the nucleus. They go into the cytoplasm of the cell and they get converted into the spike protein. And then the spike protein gets expressed on the surface of our cells, and antibodies get produced to that spike protein so that we can develop an effective immune response to prevent infection. The Johnson & Johnson vaccine is a DNA-based vaccine delivered in a viral vector. And the vector is just really a tool to deliver the DNA into the cells. The virus does not replicate or reproduce. It's just a tool to get the DNA into our cells. So this DNA will enter the nucleus of the cell, but it will get immediately made into the mRNA or the blueprints and get shuttled into the cytoplasm and get made into protein, the spike protein. And again, our body can then make antibodies to the spike protein to help prevent us from getting COVID-19. So that's what I mean about thinking through the information. And this information about altering your DNA first came about when the mRNA vaccines were circulating. And if we think through it, the mRNA doesn't even need to go to the nucleus and it can't get into the nucleus. So how would it alter our DNA? So we have to critically think through the things that we're seeing that are circulating on the internet.
Sign me up for Dr. McGinnis's class. Where were you when I did my bio degree? That was awesome. Well, thank you. And I will say, I'll share with our audience that I had a conversation about a week and a half ago with my wife's cousin. Her biggest concern was that DNA would be altered in her cells. I mean, that was a major part of her concern. So thanks for that. Tanisha, what else are you hearing?
Yeah, I think one of the final major concerns that I've heard is from parents. There's this thought that signing yourself up for a vaccine, or this vaccine in particular, you're participating in a science project. And while some of those parents have decided to get the vaccine for themselves, they're very hesitant to submit their children for this. They don't want their children to be a part of some experiment. And I know that 12 and older are going to be eligible for the vaccine, and I think that hesitancy is just going to increase now that more children are eligible.
So as I asked for a response to that, I'll give us all a 5-minute warning here, and actually it's a short 5 minutes. Dr. Jarvis, if you could comment.
Yeah, so I think the bigger experiment would be allowing your child to be exposed to the virus and seeing what the consequences of that would be, and that would be a detrimental experiment. And that's really what the issue is here. Again, all vaccinations are safe and effective. The experimental portion of this vaccine is well over, just simply because of the sheer number of individuals who have already been vaccinated with these vaccines. Typically, as I've said before, after about 1 million doses of vaccine is usually when we start seeing issues, whether that be severe side effects or consequences from the vaccine. Now we're talking about tens of millions of people who have already received these vaccines and are not seeing those severe side effects or consequences. And so that's important to know. Volume means everything here. And the volume that we have here is well beyond anything we have ever seen from a clinical trial, as we've said before today. What I really fear is that we are starting to see more and more children who are affected with COVID-19. And we know that there are long-term consequences there. We know that there's something called multi-system inflammatory disease. That's an effect of COVID-19 that affects only children and devastates them by having multi-system organ failure, and in fact can lead to death. That's what you're trying to prevent, is to have that. The best safety we can do is vaccination. We do that all the time in children by vaccinating them against childhood diseases, and we vaccinate adults against adult diseases. This is a disease that doesn't care whether you're old, young, black, white, Republican, or Democrat. It is just there to harm, and our best way to prevent that harm is through vaccination.
Great. Well, thank you for that. And, I think we've all heard about, microchips. The latest that I've been hearing is that it connects us to the 5G network. I just have one glib question for you, Dr. Jarvis. Does that mean we won't get a monthly fee if we're connected to the 5G network via our vaccine?
One would only hope, but no, as I've said before, while it's great to see Tony Stark and his nanotechnology, that technology actually doesn't exist. If we were able to put a microchip in, it would not fit through the needle for these vaccines. One of the things, and we talked about a little bit about people's hesitancy due to needle fear. These vaccines, because of the molecular way that they are delivered, actually require a very, very tiny needle to be delivered. Those of you who have had microchips placed in any of your pets know that that is a very large needle, because it needs to be large to put the microchip through it. We use very, very tiny needles because mRNA is microscopic and doesn't need to be very big to go through. We don't need a very big needle to do it. So we wouldn't even have the ability to do that. And frankly, if the government wanted to spy on you, you guys carry phones with you wherever you go, and those are connected to 5G. And by the way, I appreciate the faster download speeds. So,
thank you very much. I'll switch over. Emily, what else are you hearing out there?
I know one big concern that especially young women have is if getting the vaccine will affect menstruation, or also if it would affect fertility. I think a lot of young women my age have a concern that they get the vaccine now, and then 10 years when they're trying to conceive, they won't be able to as a result of the vaccine.
Dr. Marnick, would you like to tackle that? And I'm going to thank you right now for all of your effort in answering the questions in the chat. That's very helpful. We have lots and lots of engagement today. So, Dr. Marnick?
Yeah, so I think this is a really important example too of going back to what Dr. McGinnis said about finding where this information originated from. And this is one of the most common fears that I hear people express as well. And I will say that I'm fully vaccinated and plan to have more children. So it's not something that as a scientist I'm concerned about, because there's no basis in scientific fact. But if you go to where this myth originated from, it's because somebody decided that because the spike protein, which is what your body produces antibodies to, both if you're infected naturally or if you get vaccinated. So they said that because the spike protein has amino acids, which I'll explain what those are in a second, similar to a placenta protein, it means that the antibodies you make against the spike protein are going to cause you to be infertile. And this is not true. So proteins are the building blocks of your cells, or what make up living organisms. And all proteins are made up of 20 amino acids. Those are the building blocks. I like to explain those like 20 different colored Lego blocks. If I take those 20 different colored Lego blocks and make a castle, and then take 20 more of those same colored Lego blocks and make a house, I can tell the difference. Even though they have those same building blocks, I can tell the difference because they have a different structure. And the same is true for the spike protein versus that placental protein. yes, they share some same amino acids, but every single protein does because there's only 20 amino acids to choose from. So your body and your immune system is very sophisticated. Your immune system is not going to mistake the placenta protein for the spike protein. And we now also have a lot of data from people who've gotten pregnant after getting vaccinated or who were vaccinated while pregnant. And none of those data shows concerning safety signals for risk of miscarriage or for any sort of birth defects.
So thank you for that. We've actually reached the end of our time today, and as you could tell, we'd all love to keep going. So for those of you who we didn't answer your questions in the chat room, our team will try to pick up on that. Feel free to reach out to Lainey Abbott and get to us that way. We'd love to answer your questions. I think we all recognize that vaccine hesitancy engages people significantly, and we'll be revisiting that over the coming months. We've included some tools for you at the end of this presentation. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you to our experts and special guests. I hope this hour has been a help to support you, your employees, and our communities to safely manage your business. Just a reminder, we will be emailing you a survey right after our conference. Please be sure to give us your feedback so we can continue to provide relevant information. Our next session will be on May 20th. Our theme is the pandemic's impact on mental health and substance use. The topics will include looking at the details that 1 in 3 people have longer-term mental health and neurological symptoms after COVID, an increase in diagnoses of anxiety and mood disorders, rising alcohol use in Maine, and the latest on COVID-19 and vaccinations. We will send you the link for this session. We encourage you to share the invitation with your friends, colleagues, and others who might benefit from this information. By working together, we will keep Maine safe. Thank you and have a good afternoon.